Okay guys, this is practical number 4, the vertebral column. It looks very intimidating, but trust me, it becomes redundant after a while, and it's all like the same structures just on the different vertebrae. So you need to recognize what each vertebrae, or the characteristics of what makes each vertebrae what it is. So let's get started with cervical. I have them lined up here in order actually, but you will not have that luxury on the test. I will tell you that much. I'll mix them up, so don't come up expecting them to be in order or you being allowed to move them around. I'm just trying to get you prepared for something you may see at the next level. Anyway, let's start with the 3 cervical vertebrae that I have here. Okay, what makes these cervical are these little holes called foramen. They're called the transverse foramen. Okay, this is C1, also known as the atlas. This is C2, also known as the axis. There's a hole, there's a hole. That makes that a cervical vertebra. Here's just one of the other vertebrae that are cervical, and I know that because these are the holes. And what those holes are for the cranial nerves, the 12 cranial nerves. Okay, excuse me, 8 cranial nerves. Okay. I just said something wrong, but I'll correct myself when it's time. This is actually a thoracic vertebra. What makes this a thoracic vertebra is not this little pointy spine, which it kind of normally they all do have. But remember when we talked about, if you've done the thorax and coxal, we talked about the ribs and where the ribs articulate. These little divots here are facets for the articulation of the rib, for the tubercle of the rib, which we'll get to. Okay, that's what makes that a thoracic vertebra. No holes or no spine. That's just what makes it. The 5 lumbar vertebrae, or vertebra, they have this really thick body because these are at the bottom of the spinal column, and they take a lot of the torsion and the stress and things that happen over your lifetime. These are the ones that usually go, the discs in between usually get the most pressure on them, and they herniate sometimes. So these are this thick body right here, which is what that's called, the body of the lumbar vertebra. That's kind of the characteristic that makes that what it is. And of course, that's the sacrum. So let's get started on each. I'm going to go down the list. So again, these are cervical vertebrae. You could pick, if you get a card that says cervical vertebra, just because this is a specific one and so is this, doesn't mean you can't pick this one as a cervical vertebra. All 3 of these are because of those transverse foramen. Okay, so let's start with a regular, let's not start with the specialties. Let's start with this cervical vertebra. These, of course, are the transverse foramen. Okay, transverse processes, they kind of stick out. So this is one transverse process. Here's the other transverse process of a cervical vertebra. Spinous process, this is what's going to be sticking out. You run your finger down your spine, this is what you feel. Okay, the spinous processes. And obviously they're angled downward so that they're not sticking all the way out. Okay. Vertebral foramen, this is where your spinal cord's going to go. So that's your vertebral or vertebral foramen. Each one of these articulates with another one. So the one on top articulates with the bottom of the one that's on top of it, and articulates on the top of one that's underneath it. Hopefully that makes sense. So we have facets or flat articular surfaces that do that. So these would be the superior articular facets of this particular vertebra. And then if I look underneath it, obviously these are going to be the inferior articular facets. Okay, so that's just a cervical vertebra in general. These are special, these 2. This, if you've done the skull, this is what your skull sits on. This is it. Okay, these are the superior articular facets of the atlas. So this is the atlas. This is C1. This guy right here is the axis. This is C2. I always remember T comes before X. So atlas comes before axis. Whatever you need to do to remember that. So these are the superior articular facets of the atlas. So this is where the skull is going to sit on those occipital condyles are going to sit right on top of these facets. Underneath, these are the inferior articular facets of the axis. We still have the transverse foramen. There's one, and there's the other. And then, of course, we have the vertebral foramen. Okay. Axis. superior articular facets. This is where the C1, where C1 is going to sit right on top, or the atlas is going to sit right on top of this guy, and your head pivots on this guy. Okay. The inferior articular facets are going to be on the bottom, of course, and there's one, and there's the other. Turning it back. Transverse process, there's that one, there's that one. Okay. And then we have the vertebral foramen, of course, that's going to be these. And we also have the transverse foramen of the axis. Okay. So that takes care of the cervical vertebra. Here is a thoracic vertebra. We're looking at it from the back, and we're looking at it from the front. Okay. Here's the superior articular facets, a little bit different than the cervical. Here's one, here's another. Of course, the inferior ones are going to be underneath. There's one, there's the other. Okay. Transverse process of thoracic vertebra, that would be this guy and this guy. Spinous process, okay, that's of the thoracic vertebra. Vertebral foramen, you see how it's repeating? It's just a different vertebrae. Vertebral foramen, hole for the spinal cord. And then, of course, we have the facet that I talked to you about that makes this a thoracic vertebra. Right here is one of the facets for the articulation of one rib. And on the other side, you have a matching rib that will articulate on this facet right here. So these are facets for the tubercle of the rib on a thoracic vertebra. Okay. Lumbar vertebra. Okay. Pretty easy, right? Here's the body that I mentioned makes it, that nice thick body that gives us our padding, not padding, but actual, support for torsion and weight. And as we get older, we put a lot of pressure on this stuff as we do things, right? Transverse process, they're a little bit smaller on this one. You could pick a better one. Those are kind of like the wings. Transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae. Spinous process, of course, this is what you feel when you rub your fingers down your back, run your fingers down your back. Vertebral foramen of the lumbar vertebrae. Pretty simple, okay? Sacrum. This guy is that fused vertebra, and if I take us back to the full skeleton, okay, this is going to be down here. So here are our lumbar vertebra. When we start seeing ribs, those are thoracic vertebra. When we stop seeing ribs, these 7 up here are going to be your cervical vertebra. So back down to the sacrum, you can see the holes here. Those are foramen as well. I'm going to go back to the individual disarticulated bone, and this would be the sacrum. You might get the card that just says sacrum. These also have superior articular facets because L5, or the 5th lumbar vertebra, has to sit on top of this. So that's where it articulates. So these are the superior facets, articular facets of the sacrum. This is the median. I'm going to turn it sideways so you can see there's a little crest here. This is the median middle sacral crest. These are sacral foramina, these holes, little holes. And then there's no coccyx here, but that would be where the tailbone is, or the coccyx. And that's the vertebral column.